War does not determine who is right, only who remains alive.
Mm.
That is a quote from Bertrand Russell. And, for the longest time, that was really the ultimate truth of human conflict.
Right. Two sides clash, the dust settles, and you basically just look around to see who is still standing.
Exactly. But when you look at the modern geopolitical landscape today, that historical view it feels almost completely obsolete.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally shifted.
Because today, the battlefield isn't just, a physical space in the Middle East. The battlefield is the global supply chain.
Yeah.
It's the price of the gas in your car, the profit margins of these massive multinational corporations, and honestly, the domestic political survival of leaders who are sitting halfway across the world.
Right. It's all connected now.
It really is. And you, the listener, you are stepping right into the middle of that battlefield with us today, because we are looking at the late February escalation, what started as this limited confrontation between Iran, the United States, and Israel.
Which was tense enough on its own.
Right, but then it rapidly mutated into this multidimensional global crisis.
And to really map out the anatomy of a crisis this complex, we can't just look at troop movements. I mean, we're synthesizing battlefield logistics from the Institute for the Study of War with real-time global market data from ING Think.
Wow.
Yeah, and we're taking geopolitical risk assessments from the RAND Corporation and the Atlantic Council, and we're overlaying those with on-the-ground reporting from Haaretz and The Guardian.
That is a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but the goal here is to see how, like, a missile strike in the Middle East immediately ripples outward to, spike inflation in your hometown.
And before we get into the actual mechanics of how that happens, we really need to set the ground rules for this conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Because our mission on this deep dive is absolutely not to take any political sides.
Right, no sides.
We are not endorsing any government's actions, and we aren't judging the morality of the policies we're about to discuss. We are strictly here to impartially report on the geopolitical, military, and economic data that's provided in these sources.
Because there is so much political rhetoric out there.
Exactly. And we want to cut through all of that rhetoric and just answer the ultimate driving question of this entire narrative, which is, beyond the missiles, who actually benefits from this war and who is paying the ultimate price.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to figure out who the real winners and losers are, we really have to start with the sheer, overwhelming force of the initial clashes.
Right, because that was intense.
Very. In those first few hours and days, the data paints an incredibly one-sided picture. We saw this rapid, decisive military advantage established by the U.S. and Israel.
What did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, according to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, Israel alone conducted hundreds of sorties in just the first few days. Hundreds. And these were precision strikes cutting deep into Iranian territory. They were specifically targeting command centers, missile silos, drone manufacturing infrastructure. It was just a systematic, surgical degradation of their operational capabilities.
Right, and that military dominance really hits its peak, I think, on March 13th, when the United States entered the fray directly.
Yes.
With that massive strike on Karg Island. I mean, U.S. Central Command reported destroying over 90 military targets in that single operation.
Which is huge.
It's massive, but it's not even the number of targets that matters here, right? It's the location.
Exactly. Karg Island is the absolute nerve center of Iran's economy.
Yeah.
It handles nearly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
90%.
Yeah, 90%. It's this massive complex of storage tanks and supertanker berths. So when CNCOM hits 90 targets there, they aren't just, degrading a military base.
Yeah.
That strike was effectively an economic decapitation. By crippling that infrastructure, you are instantly erasing their primary source of national revenue. So if you were just looking at the traditional military ledger in those early moments, the United States and Israel are the clear winners. I mean, Iran's budget is basically up in smoke.
See, I look at those initial strikes, and it feels like watching a grandmaster in chess just execute this brilliant opening sequence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
They've swept the board, they've taken out the major pieces, and mathematically it just looks like game over. But I have to push back a little on that traditional ledger.
Okay, go for it.
If Iran's drone facilities are smoking craters, and the island that handles 90% of their exports is paralyzed, I mean, how do they even continue to fight? A modern military requires billions of dollars just to operate.
Right.
If their revenue is gone, shouldn't the war functionally end?
What's fascinating here is how Iran mathematically adapts to that exact disadvantage. They know they cannot match the air superiority or the defense budgets of the U.S. and Israel, so they just refuse to play the same game.
They changed the rules.
Exactly. They launched Operation True Promise, which the analysis from Haaretz points out fundamentally shifts the mechanics of the conflict.
How so?
Well, instead of trying to rebuild a conventional air force, they rely on this dispersed network of regional allies and waves of relatively cheap mobile ballistic missiles and drones.
So it's asymmetric warfare, but it's really an economic strategy in disguise.
Precisely. It is the brutal math of attrition. Think about it. Iran's proxies can launch a mass-produced drone that costs maybe, $20,000 to build.
Okay.
But to shoot that drone out of the sky and actually protect a city, the U.S. or Israel has to fire a sophisticated precision interceptor missile. And that costs $2 to $3 million.
Oh, wow. So even when you win, you lose.
Every single time the defense system works perfectly, the defender loses millions of dollars. It completely transforms the conflict from a sprint, a rapid series of decisive strikes into this grueling, long war of attrition.
Right.
And it's designed to financially bankrupt the opponent's defense grid over time.
Which means a quick, decisive military victory is basically an illusion. You can't just bomb Karg Island and declare the war won when the opponent's strategy is to slowly bleed your treasury dry through like 1,000 cheap proxy attacks.
Exactly.
And if a decisive military victory on the front lines is impossible, the battlefield inevitably has to shift. The focus moves from the Middle East straight to the home front.
It does.
Which brings us to this highly counterintuitive reality, how being locked in a seemingly unwinnable war can actually be a massive benefit for politicians domestically.
Yeah, it is the ultimate political paradox. Let's look at the mechanics of it in Israel first.
Okay.
The sources highlight that the government has utilized the ongoing conflict to enforce national mobilization. When a nation is actively under threat from drone swarms and ballistic missiles, it triggers this profound rally around the flag effect.
So the war essentially becomes a tool for political legitimacy.
Absolutely. The existential threat of the Iranian threat narrative supersedes any domestic political disagreements or protests that were happening before the war.
So wait, what does this all mean? Are you saying that the data suggests that the leaders on both sides of this conflict are finding a bizarre sort of job security in the chaos? Because it's not just Israel, right? The dynamic in Iran is almost identical.
It is, which is honestly the most ironic part of all this.
Right.
If you look at the Rand Corporation's analysis of Iran,
Right.
you would assume that suffering massive airstrikes, having your oil exports crippled, and facing severe economic damage would instantly destabilize the Iranian leadership.
And I mean, yeah, you'd think the populace would be furious.
Right, but historically and currently, being attacked by foreign powers fosters this fierce internal unity. It strengthens nationalist rhetoric, and more importantly, it empowers the hardliners within the Iranian government.
Because they can point to the outside threat.
Exactly. It gives them the perfect, undeniable justification to silence domestic opposition. Any internal economic hardship or political dissent is immediately blamed on the external enemy.
So the war acts as a pressure valve. Both Israeli and Iranian leadership use the continuation of the conflict to manage their own populations.
Yes.
But the United States doesn't really get to play by those same political rules, do they? The dynamic for Washington has to be completely different.
But Washington is in a much more precarious position.
Mhm.
The Atlantic Council explicitly outlines the growing domestic pressure within the U.S. as this war of attrition drags on.
Because we're not fighting for survival.
Exactly. The U.S. is not fighting for its literal survival the way the regional players are, which means the American public's tolerance for the cost of the war is incredibly low.
Right.
You have an electorate dealing with rising energy anxieties and fierce, polarizing debates over the true strategic purpose of U.S. involvement. So while Israeli and Iranian leaders find these short-term political windfalls in the crisis, U.S. leadership faces escalating political risk and public backlash.
Especially the longer American tax dollars are tied up in, shooting down $20,000 drones with $3 million missiles. It's incredible to see the mechanics of it. The politicians are actively using the machinery of war to secure their own positions. But while they are playing this political chess game with public opinion, the actual tangible profits, the billions of dollars are being made elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you want to know what's really driving the modern global order, you always have to follow the money into the corporate sector.
And in this conflict, the corporate winners are overwhelmingly clear, starting with the defense companies. Remember that math of attrition we just talked about?
The interceptor missiles.
Right. When we talk about hundreds of Israeli sorties or repelling waves of thousands of Iranian drones, we are talking about thousands of precision weapons, jet fuel, and interceptor missiles being expended rapidly.
And they have to be replaced.
Exactly. The demand for air defense systems skyrockets, and stockpiles must be replenished immediately. That translates directly into massive, guaranteed, decade-long contracts for defense contractors. War functionally equals long-term profit for that specific sector.
And right alongside them are the energy giants. The Guardian reported that as this conflict escalated, oil surged past $100 per barrel.
Yeah, that's a huge spike.
It is. And when that happens, companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, and Shell, they reap absolutely immense profits. They aren't the ones dropping the bombs, and their production costs haven't actually gone up.
Right.
But their balance sheets just explode in value simply due to the global market panic.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is all about how the market prices in the geography of risk. Those massive profits are generated not necessarily because the oil has stopped flowing completely, but because the market is terrified of the possibility that the major trade routes could be severed at any moment.
Let's actually talk about that geography, specifically the Strait of Hormuz, because Visual Capitalist points out that 20% of the world's oil flows through that one waterway.
It's a massive bottleneck.
It's only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. So instead of just a shipping lane, think of the Strait of Hormuz like a single-lane toll booth for a massive stadium parking lot.
That's a great analogy.
Right. It doesn't matter how fast the cars are or how many cars there are. If a conflict drops a roadblock in front of that single toll booth, the entire system backs up.
Yeah.
Maritime insurance premiums multiply by a factor of 10 literally overnight because the ships are entering a war zone. And every single cent of that increased shipping cost gets passed directly to the consumer.
Which is exactly why this conflict cannot just be a contained three-way fight between Iran, Israel, and the U.S.
Right.
That economic chokehold at the toll booth forces every neighboring country and every global superpower to rapidly alter their own strategies. We are watching the map of the Middle East, and frankly the world, being redrawn in real time by opportunistic bystanders who are reacting to these shifting economics.
I want to look at those regional ripples. You have a country like Turkey playing this incredibly delicate balancing act. How does a war between their neighbors actually serve their interests?
Well, Turkey is essentially looking at the chaos and seeing a strategic vacuum. Iran historically project a massive amount of influence into places like Syria and Iraq by funding local militias.
Right.
But with Iran's command structure heavily distracted and their budget severely restricted by those strikes on Karg Island, their grip on those militias naturally weakens.
Oh, so Turkey steps in.
Exactly. Turkey is cautiously using that vacuum to expand its own geopolitical footprint, securing its borders and its own energy routes in Syria and Iraq. They're playing the margins, gaining regional power while strictly avoiding direct confrontation.
But then you contrast Turkey's opportunism with the Gulf states. I mean, they aren't direct participants in this war either, but they are sitting in an incredibly vulnerable position.
Very vulnerable.
They host major U.S. military bases, and their economies rely entirely on critical oil infrastructure and, these massive desalination plants.
Yes.
If Iran's True Promise operation decides to target American assets in the region, those cheap drones could easily hit Gulf state infrastructure. They essentially become the collateral damage in a war they didn't start and can't control.
And that is the reality of modern regional politics. The shifting geography of risk allows some nations to find pathways to expand, while others find themselves utterly trapped in the crossfire.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
If we step even further back from the Middle East and look at the grand chessboard, we have to look at the global superpowers. Because when the United States is pouring billions of dollars, military assets, and total political attention into a war of attrition in the Middle East, somebody else is inevitably taking advantage of that distraction.
This raises an important question. Who truly benefits from a distracted America? Look at the data on Russia.
What does it say?
According to the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Russia is a massive hidden winner in this scenario. First, they benefit directly from those surging oil prices we talked about. Russia is a major oil exporter, so that $100 per barrel price tag directly funds their own state mechanisms and military operations.
Right. It's just pure revenue for them.
Exactly. But far more importantly, a Western world that is entirely consumed by a crisis involving Israel and Iran is a West that is significantly less focused on Ukraine. For Moscow, the Middle East conflict is the perfect geopolitical and economic diversion.
It's wild to think about the inverse of that with China, because you would assume Beijing is popping champagne watching the U.S. get bogged down in the Middle East instead of focusing on the Indo-Pacific.
Geopolitically, you might think so. But economically, the World Economic Forum data shows that China is actually caught in a severe bind.
Really? How so?
Yes, they enjoy a temporary reduction in direct diplomatic or military pressure from the U.S. But China's massive manufacturing economy is heavily reliant on imported Middle Eastern oil to function.
Oh, of course.
They are the world's factory. So when the price of oil surges past $100 a barrel, the cost to produce and export their goods skyrockets. It stalls their economic engine. So for Beijing, any geopolitical benefit of a distracted U.S. is almost entirely offset by the crushing economic cost of the energy shock.
It's a dizzying web. I mean, we've talked about politicians using the threat of war to secure their domestic legacies. We've talked about defense contractors securing decade-long contracts to build interceptor missiles. We've talked about Russia using the distraction to fund its own military goals.
Yeah.
But in all of this high-level geopolitical and economic theory, we're completely ignoring the people who are actually footing the bill for this entire grand game.
We are talking about the ultimate losers. And the warnings from ING Think are incredibly bleak on this front.
What are they warning about?
That the real losers in a modern war of this scale aren't just the military forces taking casualties on the front lines. The profound, lasting damage is inflicted on energy-importing developing countries, and most importantly, on civilian populations globally.
And this is where it stops being an abstract theory in a think tank report and starts hitting you directly. When you read a report mentioning supply chain disruptions or energy shocks, it sounds sterile. It sounds like a problem for economists.
Right.
But let's trace the actual mechanics of what happens when that toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz gets blocked. A missile hits a tanker. Maritime insurance premiums spike. Because insurance is higher, the cost to put a shipping container on the water doubles.
Yes.
Because shipping doubles, the cost of the fertilizer inside that container doubles. Because the fertilizer is more expensive, the cost of the grain grown with it doubles.
And by the time that chain reaction finishes, the price of a loaf of bread in a developing nation has tripled, leading to immediate food insecurity and social instability. The shockwave doesn't stop at the borders of the conflict.
Exactly. It reaches all the way down into your own neighborhood. It means the cost of fuel to get to work spikes overnight. It means a slow, crushing wave of global inflation that completely outpaces your wage growth. It is a declining standard of living that bypasses the politicians and the corporate boardrooms entirely and lands squarely on the shoulders of the middle and lower classes.
Yeah, and that really is the defining synthesis of all these sources. This conflict unequivocally proves that modern wars do not produce a single clear victor.
No.
The days of a peace treaty, neatly declaring a winner and a loser, are gone. Instead, these conflicts create a complex, messy global web. You have political and corporate winners thriving in the chaos, leveraging the risk for power and profit.
Right.
Meanwhile, entire nations and global civilian populations absorb the economic devastation.
Right.
And the one brutal, constant rule of modern geopolitics is this: the longer a war of attrition drags on, the more losers there will be. And the vast majority of those losers will be people who never had a say in starting the conflict to begin with.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the smoking oil infrastructure of Karg Island to the mathematics of proxy warfare. all the way to the profit margins of global energy giants. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final chilling thought to mull over.
Okay.
We started this conversation talking about survival. But if we've learned today that prolonged war has become a highly profitable enterprise for global defense and energy corporations, and a politically stabilizing tool for the leaders involved, what actual incentive does anyone in power have to seek a lasting peace?
That's a tough question.
It is. Keep questioning the narratives you hear. Look past the headlines and remember that when the dust settles, it's never just about who remains alive. It's about who owns the world they're left standing in.